So, good evening everyone. My name's Hannah and I'm an events assistant apprentice on the Unlocking the Severn project. Thank you all so much for attending. This event is brought to you by the Unlocking the Severn project, which is a conservation and river engagement project for people and wildlife. The Unlocking the Severn project is providing fish passage on 6 barriers on the River Severn and the River Team tributary. This will restore 158 miles of river habitat and benefit a host of important fish species. The project also includes exciting activities for people of all ages, interests and backgrounds, so that more people can be inspired by and learn from the UK's longest river. The project is being delivered in partnership by the Canal River Trust, Severn Rivers Trust, the Environment Agency and Natural England. And this is all made possible through funding from the National Lottery Heritage Fund and the EU LIFE programme. We're joined on screen by Laura, a British Sign Language interpreter, who will be present throughout. But please be mindful that this is a live recording with live interpretation and not a translation. I'll quickly run through some housekeeping and then we can get started. So please be aware that this webinar will be recorded and will, all going well, be accessible on the Unlocking the Severn YouTube channel afterwards. The webinar will last approximately 1 hour, and at any time during the webinar, you will have the opportunity to submit questions. To do so, just type your question into the Q&A section at the bottom of the control panel on your screen. Please note that we will only have a limited amount of time for questions at the end, so we may not be able to answer them all. We will do our best to answer any unanswered questions following the event in a blog post. You're welcome to use the chat throughout. It is located in the bar at the bottom of your screen as well. And please ensure that you have selected to send messages to all attendees so everyone can see them. And I would recommend trying to type hello in the chat box to practice using it. During screen sharing, you should be able to see the presentation on one side of your screen and the speakers on the other side of your screen. If this isn't the case for you, then you would like to make use of the British Sign Language interpreter, then please follow these instructions. So number 1, click on the View Options button in the top center of your screen, and then click on Side-by-Side mode in the drop-down menu. Once this is selected, a little tick will appear next to it, okay? And I will put these instructions in the chat box for your reference once I pass over to the speakers. So I will now pass over to our speakers, Dr. Katie Gutman-Roberts and Pete Davies, and I'll just stop screen sharing. There we go. Okay, I'll pass over to you guys.
That's great, thanks Hannah. Just get this in presentation mode. There we go. We're going to be telling you about some of the hidden journeys within our rivers. This is going to be a double act with myself going first. I did my PhD at Bournemouth and now I'm a researcher there. And then Pete will do the second half. These are just a few of the people, the logos, the people that I've collaborated with for the PhD. People like the Environment Agency came and assisted with collecting fish and also providing things like temperature and flow data. The Barbel Society, the anglers there, would help us catch some of our fish and also just provide loads of valuable knowledge on the species movement. And then the Severn Rivers Trust were a major funder of my PhD. Both me and Pete, we've worked on the Rivers Severn and Rivers Team. And that's a nice aerial image on the left showing the River Team coming into the River Severn and how different the two rivers are. You can see different colours and very different widths of the two rivers there. So my part is going to be about Barbel, and I'm going to tell you a bit about their ecology. So that would be the interactions between the animals and their environment. So they're a freshwater lithophilic cyprinid, and they don't migrate into the sea or into kind of saline environments. And lithophilic means that they love gravel, basically. So they love to feed in it, and they also spawn their eggs within it. The family cyprinid is the carp family, has lots of different species inside of it. And there are also lots of species of barbel, but for this talk, I'm just telling you about the European barbel, which is the only one we have in Britain. They tend to use different habitats in the river for feeding, spawning, resting, and for refuge. And so they'll also have to travel between these different habitats. In the bottom right picture, you might be able to see they have a quite downturned mouth, and that's to do with their foraging when they feed in the gravel. We know they eat a lot of invertebrates out of the gravel, but they also eat some small freshwater fish, such as minnow, but we don't really think of them as a predatory fish. They also have some kind of marine elements in their diet. So things like migrating fish that come up into the river, they might eat the eggs of like a spawning shad. And some of the baits that the anglers use also have a quite high marine content made of fish meal pellets. So barbel's range is across Central Europe and Western Europe, and they only naturally colonize the rivers on the east coast of England. And because they're not able to travel through the sea easily, they'd never naturally colonize the rivers on the west, such as the River Severn. So they were actually introduced here intentionally. And the photo at the bottom right is one of the first barbel ever brought into the River Severn. So it was one of 500 fish, and they were brought to provide an angling opportunity for people that like to fish for fun. And it was really successful. They established well, and now they naturally breed and recruit there. And plenty of anglers come from all around the UK to fish there. Some people have already studied barbel movement in other places in their native range, and we know that often there are some fish that are very mobile and travel a lot, and others that are quite sedentary and have a smaller home range. So some of my questions were about how variable the barbel's movement patterns would be and what might be driving differences in this movement. And I was also interested in some of the weirs in the rivers. So Powick Weir is the top right photo, and this was built in 1475 by the prior of Great Malvern Abbey. So a channel was dug to divert water from the River Team over to the mill, which is in the bottom picture, initially to grind grain to make flour for bread. And then in the 1720s, the mill was then used for iron forge and supplying some of the manufacturing across the UK. And then in the 1890s, it was converted into a hydropower station, providing electricity for streetlights and houses throughout Worcester. And at the time, it was the largest hydropower station in Britain. But this was shut down in about the 1920s. So for the last 100 years, the structure has been without any real function. And Diglis Lock was built much later in 1844, mostly to make the River Severn navigable by boat. So why are we interested in those as fish biologists? Well, we know that weirs and dams are an international issue for migratory fish, but what there's less evidence of is how these barriers might affect fish that stay within the river all throughout the year. So animals like the cyprinid family that I'm talking about. And I was interested to know if the different barbels, the different weirs might have specific structures that might affect the movement of the barbel over them. And could removing these barriers enable increased connectivity between habitats? So I looked across the two weirs, Powick and Diglis, to see if they affected movement equally, if the barriers were passable, and if that was at all times of year or just under certain conditions, and maybe also individual fish might pass in different ways. And then we followed up and looked at how passage changed after a partial removal. So we did this, we initially caught 22 barbel in 2015, and we did that in 2 different methods. So on the left we have electric fishing, where we tow a boat along and a small current goes through the water. This makes the fish kind of lose balance, and when they turn on their side, we're able to easily capture them. We can put them in our buckets and take them for processing. And then we've also been working with recreational anglers who have been able to catch them, pop them in keep nets, and then we come along and collect them from them. So we measured their fork length, which is just a measure of size. So we measure from the tip of the nose until the fork in the tail. And then we tag them with these acoustic pingers. So the tag is on the top there, quite zoomed in. It's actually very small, about 2 to 3 centimeters long. And it's actually surgically implanted just inside the fish. So they're anesthetized so they don't feel the procedure. And then a suture closes up the wound afterwards. And these tags will emit a series of pings, which each have their own unique number. And then the fish are recovered. We have kind of small paddling pools on the side of the river, and we wait until they're feeling healthy again, and then we release them back into similar locations where we caught them from. And so that allows us to record their movement within the river. We have these kind of listening stations that we attach to different structures throughout the river, and they'll record for about 2 years of data. And then we can just regularly go and download the information. And this is just a visualization of how much data we can recover, because it's collecting all year round, whereas other methods in the past have required the researcher to go to the riverbank each time to locate the fish. So I was very glad to be using this method. So I looked at a couple of metrics. One is home range, where we can just look at the length of river that the fish has moved in. So if we have receivers A and B, and the fish has been detected on 2 receivers, an example that could be 600 meters. And we always measure it by the distance of the river, obviously not as the crow flies. And then some of the metrics I'll talk about is total movement. And this is a measure of activity. So for example, if it had traveled from A to B and then back up to A and then back down to B again, we would just times that initial distance by 3, and that would be 1,800 meters. So one of my questions was, would larger barbel be able to move further? You know, bigger fish has more muscles, a larger tail. You might imagine they'd have a better swimming capacity. But on the left is the home range, and we found that even though it was very variable, with some fish swimming only a distance of less than 1 kilometre within a whole year, and some fish travelling 12 kilometres within the year, there didn't really seem to be any relationship with the length of the fish. And the same for the total movement or the activity, where we see some fish moving just over 15 kilometres within a year and others travelling 68 kilometres. So larger barbel don't necessarily always move further. And then on to the 2 weirs. So on the left we have Powick Weir in the River Team, and on the right we have Diglis Weir in the River Severn. Now they're both quite a similar height, but you might be able to see the structures are quite different. So on the left it has boulders on top and quite variable flow across the width. And that concrete strip at the bottom is a fish pass. So inside of there are kind of staggered concrete blocks, enabling the fish to go up and rest behind each block as it migrates upstream. They're generally designed for salmon and not so specifically made for barbel. So we weren't really sure if the barbel might use those. And then on Diglis Weir, it's a much flatter concrete structure with very similar flow across the width. And what's just out of sight is a functioning boat lock, which we didn't imagine a barbel would use, because as the lock gate opens and the boat travels in, the engine would be on, and this kind of noise and disturbance we didn't imagine would go hand in hand with a barbel entering the lock. But we'd be able to see if they did travel in there. So out of our 22 fish that we tagged, only 7 of them ever approached Powick Weir, and 3 of those actually successfully went over the weir. So almost 50% of the fish. And for Diglis, even though a similar number approached it, we never recorded any fish ascending it. So we wondered if that would be the same at all times of year. I'd heard people say that the barrier might not be an issue because in the winter, during the high river levels where we've had a lot of rain, the weir's almost not visible. And so you would imagine a fish could just swim over the top at that time of year. But it seemed like the river flow didn't affect whether there was a successful or unsuccessful ascent up over the weir. And that's probably because there's no real motivation of fish to travel upstream during the winter. There's generally less food in the winter and it's colder, so fish are trying to save energy as opposed to deciding to travel upstream in the flow. The kind of plot on the right is a measure of day length, and that just signifies the time of year. So all 3 barbel ascended towards the end of March and the beginning of April, which we know from other studies is when fish tend to carry out an upstream migration to get to their spawning gravels. Now, obviously, time of year is quite linked to temperature as we're going into spring, and also obviously lots of fish are ectotherms, so they don't have the ability to regulate their own body temperature, and so they want to put their eggs in the river at the right time of year so they'll develop into the best conditions. And you would think what goes up must come back down again, but actually only 2 of the 3 fish that ascended came back down over the weir. Now, as scientists, we always want a good sample size, so 2 is not really an adequate sample size. However, of these 2 fish, the one that came down in the winter descended straight over the weir. I think it was in about less than an hour. Whereas the one that came down in the summer, when the river level was low and the weir was very exposed, stayed at the top of the weir for about 11 hours until it eventually descended down through what we call the mill leat, which is this small side channel. We'd never seen any fish migrate up through that channel, and so we don't really think there's any habitat the barbel wanted to access in there, but when it couldn't find any other alternate route, the mill leat provided downstream passage. So in 2018, the weir was due to be removed, but some anglers were a bit worried it might reduce angling opportunity downstream of the weir. And so in the end, there was a partial removal, and the end result is the picture on the right. So a much more kind of natural looking slope with rocks the whole way across, and that fish pass that was there before has been removed. So we then tagged 20 more barbel, and we hope to see if migration across the weir might change following the partial weir removal. So the bottom part of the table is the new information from the 2018 tagged fish. So we had 2 more barbel approach the weir for Powick, but this time only 2 fish ascended. So it seems like a reduced number of barbel were able to go over the partially removed weir. But what was interesting was that the fish that did ascended and descended multiple times. And they didn't just ascend during that small window in spring, but they also ascended during September and June. So it maybe increased the amount of time that the weir was passable for those fish. And then on the right, we had a similar number of fish approach Diglis Weir, and no changes had happened to Diglis Weir in this time frame, but one fish did ascend this time. So just zooming in on why that might have happened. So the left two graphs are from Powick Weir, and the top one is 2015. So the red dots are where a barbel has approached the weir, but not necessarily ascended. Now we don't know that those fish were trying to ascend, but what we see on the bottom graph is that there are a lot less red dots. So maybe a reduced amount of blocked passages. And because the dots aren't very big, I've added an arrow there because we have one blue dot at a much lower flow than what we had in 2015. So it could be that the partial removal enabled access above the weir at these lower flows, which can coincide with spring and summer access to spawning gravels. And at Diglis Weir, we were very lucky in that the flow conditions from 2015 and 2018 were quite similar, but barbel in 2015 just never approached Diglis Weir during the high flows. Whereas in 2018, when they did approach at high flows, it was able to successfully ascend and descend the weir multiple times. So one of the things as scientists, our aims are we publish papers, and we know these aren't really accessible for everyone at understanding that information, and it's just not very engaging and fun for people to read all the time. And so we worked with the British Ecological Society, oh, it's just loading the page now, to create an animation where anyone would be able to go and look at the part of the river that they were interested in. So you can move around the map and choose an area of interest. And, oh, it's a bit zoomed in here. You can select the species that you're interested in. So obviously for me, that would just be barbel. And we have the time here at the bottom, so you can select the time of year you're interested in as well. And here we've got Powick Weir, so you could also select before or after the weir alteration. And then you can select these red circles, which are all the barbel, and you can see which size fish you're looking at, and also what was the temperature and the flow on that day. And then if you're not interested in that kind of level of detail, you can just play the animation and you can just watch day by day how the fish might be moving within the river. And so this is in April, and we see a lot of the fish coming into the river team during this spring period because the river team is one of the best places for these shallow spawning areas that the barbel prefer. And generally we find as it gets below 10 degrees into the winter, they often will move out into the River Severn, into the deeper channel. And weir removal not only can increase the access to upstream habitats, but it can also change the type of habitats that are upstream of the weir. And that's because the weir increases the depth of water above the weir. So when we surveyed this with drones in 2017, we found that 2 kilometres upstream of the weir was almost exclusively very deep, slow flowing water, not ideal for the spawning of barbel and other kind of shallow water spawners. So we're hoping to go back this spring to resurvey and see if there are any new spawning riffles that have arrived. And if they have, this is the kind of thing we would see when barbel are spawning. So at the moment it's the closed fishing season, and so it's a great time to just go out and be able to watch fish. So when the barbel are laying their eggs in the gravel, they'll often remove the fine sediment, which is what we see being washed out there. And that enables more oxygen to be able to travel into the gravel so that the eggs can develop in the best environment. And this in the top right, I just had to include, is a very small larval barbel after they've hatched. They're really, really cute. So it'd be great if we could increase the habitat available for them and have more of them in the river. And now this is a photo on the right of Diglis Fish Pass. That's almost finished, and soon they'll have the UK's first underwater fish viewing gallery. So I can't wait to go in there and hopefully see some barbel on the way to accessing new spawning gravels upstream in the River Severn. And so we've just been back and tagged 20 more fish. I'm glad to say we finished that just over the weekend before the close season began. And yeah, this has been done with a range of partners, including Hull University, and that's one of the anglers on the right hand side. That's Sean Nurse. He's been instrumental in us catching barbel and understanding their movements over the last 5 years. And my thesis is online, so if there's information you're interested in, you can take a note of that. We'll come back to questions at the end, but for now I'll hand over to Pete.
Thank you very much, Katie. That was a fascinating talk. Just let me share my screen. I'll be... Okay. Well, it's my pleasure to talk to you, everybody, tonight. My name is Pete Davis. I've just finished my PhD at Bournemouth University. And for the last 3 years, I've been tracking thwaite shad and sea lamprey during their migration in the River Severn. And my work has been a massive team effort, and there are far too many people to thank during the time I have, but my work was in collaboration with the University of Hull, and I was funded by Unlocking the Severn, and I received help from many different people at the Environment Agency and the Severn Rivers Trust and the Canal Rivers Trust. So just to zoom out briefly, and ask, what is migration? I think about migration as a strategy that enables animals to use different habitats at different times in their life. And it's a strategy that's found in all of the main animal groups. And these migratory movements can range from a few hundred meters to thousands of kilometers in movements that span oceans and span continents. And I've included an image of a swallow here. It's probably one of the most well-known migratory animals to people in Britain, because it signifies the arrival of spring, when it arrives in vast numbers during sort of April and May. Now, when I talk about migratory fish, I'm going to be talking about a specific subgroup of migratory fish called the diadromous fishes. And these are fish that migrate between saltwater and freshwater to complete their life cycle. Probably the most well-known examples of diadromous fish are the salmon, but there are many other species that display this life history, including eels, sturgeon, and shad. Migratory fish are incredibly important for humans in terms of their both cultural, economic, and other types of significance. They support commercial fisheries, they support recreational fisheries, as well as subsistence fisheries in many places around the world. I've included an image here of some recreational anglers for salmon in Scotland, and a fairly recent study concluded that an individual salmon landed by a recreational angler in the River Spey would contribute nearly £1,000 to local economies. When we think about migratory fish, we often tend to think about sort of cold countries, but in fact, they exist all over the world, including in tropical places such as Bangladesh. And these gentlemen here are fishing for hilsa, which is a type of shad. And this fishery is worth an incredible amount of money to people in Bangladesh, employing around 2.5 million people and worth over $1 billion. Beyond their importance for humans, migratory fish are incredibly important for ecosystems. They can be known as keystone species where they exist in large numbers. And this image here of a black bear feeding on pink salmon in Alaska is something you might have seen in nature documentaries, or if you're very lucky, in person. And it signifies the abundance or the sheer abundance that migratory fish can represent in places where they arrive in large numbers every year. And just to give you an example of what I mean by keystone species, a very famous study from earlier in 2001, in fact, concluded that 25% of the nitrogen in trees that were situated around salmon rivers in certain areas of the Pacific Northwest, 25% of the nitrogen in those trees derived directly from salmon. They, of course, also provide food for terrestrial freshwater predators. And in arriving in such large numbers in spawning, they also alter the structure of river habitats by moving gravels around, which can have quite a profound impact on the shape of our rivers. You're unlikely to find a black bear in the River Severn, but you will, of course, find migratory fish. We have all the usual suspects that you'd find in Britain, including Atlantic salmon in the Severn. We also have some rarer fish, including the Thwaite shad. Thwaite shad are a member of the herring family, and they arrive in the River Severn in around April and May to spawn. And they are repeat spawning, so they spawn in consecutive years, and they might make up to 6 consecutive annual migrations into the river during their lifespan. They display homing, and this is a process, this is quite widespread in migratory fish, whereby adults will return to areas where they emerged from the egg as a juvenile. I mentioned that the Thwaite shad are rare in Britain. They only spawn in 4 rivers, including the River Severn, as well as 3 rivers in Wales, the Wye, the Usk, and the Tawy. It's widely thought that artificial barriers, including dams and weirs that Katie was describing, as well as overfishing and pollution, have led to the decline of the Thwaite shad, as well as extinctions in many rivers across their range in Europe. This is an image of a sea lamprey. It says migratory fish on this slide, but in fact, sea lamprey are not a fish. They are a jawless vertebrate. Jawless in that they do not have a hinged jaw like most vertebrates. They cannot bite. And they are a member of an ancient animal group. In fact, the common ancestor of sea lamprey and humans is much further in the past than the common ancestor of humans and fish or other types of fish. The adult sea lamprey feed on large marine animals, including fish, sharks, whales, and dolphins. And like shad, they enter rivers to spawn in spring. But unlike shad, they do not display homing. Adults construct nests in gravel, and after spawning, they die. So this is another difference between sea lamprey and shad, in that sea lamprey generally will spawn once and then die. The juveniles then filter feed before migrating back out to sea. Historically, the sea lamprey was very important as food in Britain, and elsewhere in Europe, they're still quite highly prized for food. Now, depending on what angle you take the photo of a sea lamprey from, they either appear quite cute or absolutely horrendous. And this is the photo of the oral disc of a sea lamprey, and this is the mouth part which enables it to attach to its host animal. And this image was taken in Plymouth very recently, in Plymouth Sound, and it shows a sea lamprey attaching to a common dolphin. It's worth noting that a sea lamprey probably wouldn't do too much harm to a large animal like a dolphin or a whale, but in certain areas of the world, sea lamprey have become highly invasive in lakes, particularly in the Great Lakes of North America, where they have done a lot of damage to freshwater fish populations. And it's in fact from these areas that we know that we've gained a lot of information about sea lamprey ecology and behavior. So Katie touched on this. I'm not going to dwell too much, but I thought I would just reiterate why we study barriers. Well, fish migration requires connected habitats. These fish are obviously moving large distances between marine and freshwater environments. So those migrations are heavily reliant on those habitats being connected. But we're currently facing globally a crisis of freshwater connectivity, particularly in developed regions. A recent study estimated that for every a barrier, or such as a dam or a weir, exists every 1.5 kilometers in British rivers. And 99% of British river catchments contain barriers. So they're completely ubiquitous in a way. These barriers are heavily implicated, as we touched on, in the decline of migratory fish populations. And in fact, across the North Atlantic, for species in which data is available, around 90% have declined. They've faced 90% declines. River reconnection projects such as Unlocking the Severn are proliferating. They're becoming more ambitious in their size and their scope. And so this is another reason why we should study barriers, because knowledge of how current barriers are affecting fish migration will help inform and guide how these river reconnection projects are undertaken. And as you've probably heard a lot about now, Unlocking the Severn is aiming to address 6 weirs on the River Severn. If I get my pointer here, these 6 weirs here. And so my research has been in large part a kind of before providing a baseline of how migratory fish are currently using the river. Katie's touched on this, but just to refresh you, acoustic telemetry is the main methodology that we've been using to track fish. It involves implanting a transmitter into the fish and tracking their movements using an array of receivers, which we have deployed all through the river from the tidal reaches down near Gloucester up into Worcester and the River Team. So just some images now to describe what our field work looks like. We start with capture of the fish, in this case the shad, through angling and through a trap. The fish then resemble a Formula One car because we're taking an enormous amount of measurements from each individual, including its weight. We're taking scales, we're taking photos, and we're looking at the fat content. And these will enable us to assess how different factors affect the movement of the fish. The fish are then tagged with a transmitter before being released back into the river. And usually at this point, if you are angling, that would be the last you would see of that individual. But of course, now that we've got a tag inside it, it enables us to track their movements. And we just have to put on our glamorous looking dry suits and get in the river and retrieve our receivers and download the data. And from this data, we're able to look at the movements and start piecing together what's going on. Another way that we've been looking at the movements of the shad in particular is by monitoring their spawning activity. Now you may not know this, but shad spawn pelagically. That means that they spawn on top of the water, and shad spawning is quite a noisy affair. So by installing microphones on the riverbank like this one, we're able to record shad spawning and look at the areas where they're spawning and the intensity and how much spawning activity is occurring at different times in the spawning season. But you're unlikely to hear any of this spawning activity during the day because shad spawning is highly nocturnal. So if you're out and about on the riverbank at night, particularly in the River Severn and the River Team, you might start to hear noises like this. And I'm going to play some recordings now. So turn up your speakers if you're able to. This is the sound of a shad spawning, and if you can't hear it, to me it sounds a bit like somebody running through a puddle. But in fact, the naturalist William Yarrell in 1841, he described it much more poetically than I could. In the language of the fishermen, the shad are said to thrash the water with their tails. They appear to disencumber themselves of the matured roe by violent muscular action. And William Yarrell was describing shad spawning on the River Thames, where there used to be, at that time in the 1840s, quite a large shad fishery. But sadly, that fishery soon after the shad population on the Thames went extinct due to river pollution. So the main questions that I've been asking using acoustic telemetry are about to be displayed. So we start here with a fish tagged with a transmitter. We then look at the upstream barriers and how they're impacting the migration. We look at the freshwater phase behavior of the shad, as well as downstream barrier impacts. So any delays or preventions that barriers cause during the emigration to the sea. We can then look at marine movements, and through looking at returning fish, because these transmitters last 3 years, we're able to assess how loyal shad are to the river that they were tagged in a process called fidelity, as well as looking at individual repeatability. So whether behaviors that individuals show are repeatable from year to year. To date, we've tagged quite a few shads, 173 with these 3-year acoustic transmitters, and we'd have 71 returning fish. For the sea lamprey, it's a much more sort of linear process because they don't return to sea. So once a sea lamprey is ready to stop feeding on its marine host, it enters fresh water to spawn. And in 2018, we tagged 60 sea lamprey with acoustic transmitters in the lower River Severn. And we were interested in upstream barrier impacts and their freshwater phase behavior. So the Thwaite shads, we found that through our acoustic tracking work that Thwaite shad spend on average 30 days in freshwater, so quite a brief period in the context of their life cycle during their spawning. They're highly mobile. During their time in freshwater, we've recorded them moving an average of 250 kilometers. And for the weirs in the River Severn represent the upstream extent of migration for the majority, 57% of tagged individuals that we've recorded to date. And the delays incurred at weirs represent around 18% of the time taken to reach spawning areas. Maysmore Weir is the first structure that fish encounter on their journey into the river, and passage times here of around 2 days we've recorded. Upper Lode Weir is the next structure, around 50% passage at this weir with a passage time of 4 days. And Diglas Weir, very low passage rates at this structure, which Katie describes, which is a bad thing in terms of shad at the moment, but it's also it gives hope that the actions of unlocking the Severn at this structure by installing a fish pass will be positive for shad. I've just included this animation to display, to try and describe how variable the shad are in their movements. The red individual you can see moving a tremendous amount during its migration, whereas the blue individual spends the majority of its time in the river team moving relatively little. And I've tried to try and tease out the drivers of these differences. So displaying those two fish as a kind of heat map here, you can see the individual on the left spends the vast majority of its time in a small area, whereas the individual on the right roams more widely. And what I found is that female Thwaite shad tend to roam over a much wider area. They have a larger core area than males. And this might represent different spawning strategies, although I'm still to delve into this, and I need to look into it a bit further, I think. Once fish have left the river, if we're very lucky, we're able to track them at sea, because the beauty of this technology that we're using is that if our fish are picked up on other researchers' receivers, they are able to notify us. And so far, the fish that have left the River Severn have been detected at the Torridge Estuary and Lundy Island by colleagues at Plymouth University. And we've also had one fish detected by the Marine Institute in Ireland, and this fish was entering in December into the Munster Blackwater Estuary. And these movements represent a substantial new body of knowledge into how shad use marine environments. But it's worth noting that there are very few receivers in the marine environment, and so the actual movements, there's a lot more to discover about their actual movements. Of the returning fish that we've had moving back into freshwater, 97% of these have been recorded only entering the Severn, whereas 3% have also entered the River Wye. And the fish that returned from Ireland gave us a minimum movement distance of 950 kilometers. The returning fish also enable us to look at repeatability and space use. And these 7 panels here represent 7 fish for which we have 3 years of data, and the different colors in each panel represent the space use in each of those individual years. And just broadly speaking, it appears that these individuals are using similar areas in the river from year to year, although there are some exceptions. So I've quantified this similarity, and I've been able to show that the similarity within individuals is much greater, or significantly greater, than similarity between individuals. And this has, in my view, quite a few implications for river reconnection, because it suggests that at the moment fish are returning to the same areas from year to year. So when we remove those barriers or we install fish passes, it may take some time for those upstream areas to be recolonized because of this process of fidelity. I spent most of my time so far rattling on about Thwaite shad, that I haven't got much time to talk about sea lamprey. In general, of the sea lamprey that we released, the 60 sea lamprey we released in the lower part of the Severn, 85% of those individuals reached the upstream extent of migration at a barrier. And the delays that were incurred represented the vast majority of the time it took for those fish to reach their upstream spawning habitat. These delays and these sort of poor passage was cumulative to the extent that no sea lamprey reached areas upstream of the major navigation weirs on the River Severn. And we also found that high flows and high tides were very important for weir passage. And just to give you an example, at Diglis Weir, there was 40% passage of sea lamprey, and all of these passages occurred during a brief flood period caused by thunderstorms. Sea lamprey, like the shad, also displayed incredible diversity in movement behaviour. And these three panels, A, B, and C, just are representative of that. Don't worry too much. They're potentially quite hard to interpret if you've never seen them before, but this axis represents distance up the river, and this is time. And these dotted lines are weirs. And you can see that this individual, when it reaches this weir, it makes some small downstream movements before eventually passing it. This individual reaches the same weir, but makes extensive downstream movements, including returns to the estuary before eventually passing it. And this individual makes no recordable downstream movements during a period of delay that's quite similar to these other individuals. So much like the shad, some fascinating individual variation in behaviour that we've been able to show using our acoustic telemetry. And that just leaves me to thank all these people and thank you for listening. And I know both Katie and I would be delighted to take any questions you have. So thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you both, Katie and Pete. That was really interesting and really nice to hear all about everything you've been researching. So we will now move on to questions. Everyone, feel free to ask any more questions in the Q&A box. We've got a couple there already waiting. And we'll also be joined on screen by Alex Ball, who is a member of the Unlocking the Severn team as well. So if there's any general project questions, feel free to pop them in as well, and we will do our best to answer them. So let me just get the Q&A box up. So we have a question for Pete. How far upstream on the Severn do lamprey get?
In our study, we didn't record any sea lamprey getting as far as Lincoln Weir on the River Severn. In terms of how far they're able to get, I know that that sea lamprey have been recorded at least as far as Shrewsbury in previous years. But it's worth noting that our study was only a one-year study, and that, as I mentioned, the river conditions are very important for enabling passage of these barriers, and so variation in flow between years is probably determining how far the upstream migrating population can achieve in any given year.
Okay, yeah, that makes perfect sense. Thank you, Pete. Okay, we have another question here. So there's a bit of background saying, as an angler in the 1960s, salmon parr and kelts spent salmon after spawning, were very evident in the lower Severn around Gloucester, as were shad. Often anglers used to catch many of these fish by accident and by design. And the question is, while barriers create a migratory problem, they have barely altered since the 1960s. So how is the lack of recruitment explained, if that is within your expertise to respond to, Pete?
Thank you, Nigel. That's a great question, and you're right. Of course, barriers are only one aspect of potential difficulties that migratory fish are currently facing. There have been other changes to our rivers, including changing agricultural practices, which might be affecting recruitment. Changing climates as well. With regards to salmon, it's definitely not my area of expertise, but as far as I understand it, the reduction in salmon populations that we're observing across their range have been, rather than been pinpointed as processes that are occurring in the river, although there are obviously issues with our rivers, it seems to be a lack of marine survival in terms of how many smolts that go out to sea are returning as adults. In terms of the shad, through our tracking work, we've noticed quite high marine survival. Around 50% to 60% of the fish that go out to sea of our tagged fish are returning. But of course, when I say high, we don't really have a very good baseline. So that's probably not a very good answer to your question, but I do agree with you that barriers are only one part of the problem, and it's a multifactorial issue, and that's what makes it so difficult, and also so interesting for someone like me to try and get to the bottom of.
Wonderful, thanks, Pete. Oh, and we've got a thank you very much in the chat, so that's good. Let's have a look. We've probably got time to answer one more question, and then, as I mentioned at the beginning, we'll do our best to answer any remaining questions in a blog post. So feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box, and we will do our best to get to them and type out a response. So the next question is, when specifically are sea lampreys entering the Severn, and how long typically are they spending in the river?
Assuming that's a question for me again.
Yeah, sorry, Pete.
As far as I'm aware, although again our study, which is a one-year study, we tagged a sea lamprey in early May, but I know that sea lamprey, certainly in Britain, their migration period varies depending on where in Europe you're talking. In Southern Europe, they can enter in as early as February, but in Britain, they're usually entering our rivers in April and May, and then spawning in June. And so it's probably only, in the terms of the time that they're spending in the freshwater part of the river, it's probably around a month and a half that they're found in these areas. But again, quite temperature dependent, and so when you'll find them probably depends, can vary quite a lot from year to year.
Wonderful, thanks very much, Pete. Okay, we've reached 8 o'clock, so I will have to stop there for the Q&A session, but thank you for your answers. Sorry, Pete, that I seemed to pick on you a bit there. And thank you for Katie, because I knew
my fault for waffling on.
Oh, you didn't waffle on that badly, don't worry. And thank you for Katie for responding to one of the questions that you got asked in the chat as well before. So that was really fantastic. So I just wanted to take this moment to thank you all for attending and for staying for the length of the talk. I have put a link to a survey about the event in the text box, and it will also get emailed out following the event. We would be really grateful for any feedback if you could just take a few minutes to tell us about your experience. And if you want to hear more about the Unlocking the Severn project, I have also put a few links in the text box for you as well, but you can visit our website, which is www.unlockingthesevern.co.uk. Trying not to trip over my words. And you can also find us on social media, which is @SevernUnlocked. And you can keep up to date with the project by signing up to our newsletter as well. So thank you all once again so much for attending. Thank you to Katie and Pete for giving us a really fascinating talk, and I will bid you all a good night. Thanks ever so much.
Thanks, everybody.